Okay, welcome everybody to the second panel of the series on the psychological secrets of writing. Just to let people know, as you may have discovered, we are having a few little technical glitches with people getting into the meeting. So if you see me looking a little bit distracted, it'll be because I'm just trying to answer a few messages in the background to sort everybody out. But welcome. We're so glad to have you here. I'm just going to start with us each going round and introducing ourselves. We have a lovely panel tonight of Stephanie Carty, Emma Kavanagh and Chris Merritt. I'll let them introduce themselves individually in just a sec. And I'm going to go first because I'm the host and I'm going to kick us off. So my name is Philippa East. I'm the author of Little White Lies, which is my debut. Safe and Sound, which is my second psychological suspense book, and haven't got the book but got the t-shirt, which is my third book, I'll Never Tell, which is coming out in January. And alongside being an author, I'm also a clinical psychologist working in private practice part-time. Chris, would you like to kick us off just giving us a little bit of details about you?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Philippa. Thank you for having me. Good evening, everyone. My name's Chris Merritt. I'm a clinical psychologist and I'm a crime author. I actually started out my first career was as a diplomat. So I served overseas in the Middle East and particularly in conflict zones. And from that, kind of got interested in particularly psychology of trauma. Went back to university, trained as a psychologist, did my clinical training, and then later became an author. And I've had 7 novels published so far. That's me.
And shall we go to the third clinical psychologist that we have with us tonight? 3 clinical psychologists. That's hardcore, man. Let's go to Stephanie Carty. Tell us a little bit about you, Stephanie.
Hi, yeah, I'm Stephanie. So I'm a consultant clinical psychologist working in physical health. And before that, I used to work with children, with looked after and fostered children, which I think has influenced my writing. I started out the first few years writing really short fiction. So I've got a novella in Flash, which is looking at different coping styles of siblings. And then in non-fiction books, I teach writers about using psychological ideas for their characters. So this is my book on inside fictional minds, which is sort of a workbook. And then this year published my short fiction collection, The Peculiarities of Yearning. They are all very weird, magical stories, which I think comes from the sort of play work with children. And then in February, my first novel is coming out, which is a psychological thriller set in a sleep clinic, and it does have a psychotherapist in it.
Brilliant. And lastly, Emma Kavanagh, who is not a clinical psychologist, but in my view is something even more exciting than that. So tell us a little bit about yourself, Emma.
Well, I don't know, because Chris was a diplomat. So, I mean, that's much more exciting. I began my career as a police and military psychologist. So once I got my PhD, I went out and taught the police throughout the UK and Europe and NATO forces about what the brain does in a critical incident. So if you think you're about to die, how does your brain function change? How does that affect your cognitions and your emotions? And how will it affect your behavior and your ability to save your own life? I then went on to become a full-time author. I am on book 7, I think. So I have 6 fiction, and my first non-fiction, How to Be Broken, was published last year.
Fantastic. So we're going to obviously basically just talk all things psychology and writing tonight, and really sort of think a little bit about how our writing and our backgrounds in psychology kind of go together or don't go together or whatever. So to kick us off, perhaps I'll start with the question of which came first for you, psychology or writing, or same together? And maybe a sort of slight variation on that question. Do you see yourself more at this stage in your careers, more as a psychologist, more as a writer? How do those two identities kind of balance with each other? Let's start with you, Emma.
I think I'd have to say writing came first, because I mean, I started telling stories when I was about 6. You know, so and I started saying I was going to be an author when I was very, very little. But it was one of those things that, you know, you get that message of write what you know. And I very distinctly remember thinking, I don't know enough to be telling stories. And so for a long time, I stopped writing. And that was kind of when I found psychology and when that became a major passion for me. And it was only as my career had taken off and I realized I had things to say and I had stories to tell, which is when the writing became a part of my life again. I think at this stage, I see myself as a really nice little combination of the two. I think for a long time now, I've been a full-time author, which sort of was focused on the storytelling, but the psychology was always missing. And there was always a sense that something wasn't quite right for me. Whereas now that I've started doing nonfiction as well, it's really kind of filled that gap. So I'd say a nice half and half mix.
Yeah. And what about you, Stephanie? Because I'm blown away by the fact that you're a consultant psychologist in the NHS, and having worked previously in the NHS, I know how ridiculously demanding any NHS job is. So again, I'm really interested in how you see the balance in your identities with that NHS role.
Yeah, I think that's why I wrote flash fiction for 5 years, because the stories are 100,000 words, often 300. You can work. I've got 3 children with additional needs, and you just need 20 minutes. Like 20 minutes, you can draft a flash, and then you can come back to it a couple of days later, and you can send it off. You can get published, and it's taken a few weeks. Unlike Novel World, which is very different. So
how long is Novel World for you, Stephanie?
It is ongoing. It is ongoing. querying book 2 at the minute. So I think that's how I did it. I warmed myself up, and you can trick yourself really to getting something complete around a job that can be quite intense. But I've reduced, so I work 4 days a week NHS now, and Wednesday is my writing day. So Tuesday night's a bit exciting because tomorrow is like my child-free, work-free writing day. But I guess in a way you're never not a writer, are you? Because there's the day job, but I'm quite boundaried with work. So when I finish work, I do look at emails a little bit, but I don't work into the night. Whereas your writing head is always going. So I have my phone by my bed, loads of notes. I have 11 synopses currently for different books. So my brain just goes all the time. And so I don't think it's a split in a way. It's one and the same. But yeah, having only 1 day protected is a little bit challenging, but I do write quite fast. So yeah, we'll see.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'll just chip in and say that I think there's lots of things that factor into that balance for me. There's kind of like the finances, like which earns more, which is my financial security, which have I done longer, blah, blah, blah. And I think I'm starting to shift more towards thinking of myself as a novelist versus as a psychologist, but that's quite a scary identity shift as well. So yeah, what about you, Chris? Because I know you've had kind of a number of different roles tying in different ways with psychology and with writing. So how do you see those different elements of your identity?
Yeah, well, I think probably the psychology was there from the start, and even when I was working as a diplomat, I think I was very interested in psychology. And when you're out and about, you're meeting people overseas, you're trying to understand different cultures, trying to understand why people might believe certain things or want to do certain things. There's always psychology there, and not least the psychology of how people cope with massive trauma and adversity in war zones. But I was also, for a very long time, I was a fan of crime and thriller. So that was kind of floating around. I loved reading crime and thriller, and I particularly liked books where there was a deep exploration of characters' psychologies and motivations and backgrounds. So I think about how you work with a person, with a client as a clinical psychologist. You're you're really taking that approach. And that was an approach that I'd been enjoying kind of, if you like, in fiction in a less structured way for quite a long time. And I think, you know, as I became a writer, I then sort of realized actually there is a big overlap in psychology and writing, I think, in telling stories about a person, and particularly when you're working with something like trauma, that I'm sure the other people on this panel will have experience of as well, is very much often a process of telling a story about what happened and finding a narrative and a narrative voice that gives power to the person who's telling the story. And for me, that's the same with a crime and thriller as well. And so I'm very interested when I write in trying to capture the character's perspective and sort of write in that more, I think what's called more of a kind of a close associative style, where you feel, hopefully anyway, if I'm doing it right, you know, when you read it, you feel like you're in the character's head and it's sort of written in their voice. And I think it's big overlap between psychology and writing for that reason. And I guess I when people say, what do you do? I say I'm a psychologist and an author. I kind of say that they're two separate things, but I know there's one clinical psychologist who's also a thriller writer called Frank Tallis, whose work I really liked, you know, for many years before I became either a psychologist or a writer. And he says that as a writer, he considers himself a clinical psychologist, just working in different ways because of the issues that he's tackling in his books. So yeah, there's just big overlap, I think.
Yeah, I think that's I think the overlap is huge, and the more that I write, the more I see those overlaps. And very much like you, Chris, I often think of it as, because people say like, oh, you know, what led you to writing from being a psychologist? And I always say, but they're the same thing. Like both of them are my efforts to try and say, how do humans work? Or rather, how the fuck do humans work? You know, and trying to answer that through the kind of science and discipline of studying psychology, and then trying to answer that question through telling stories. So for me, I think they're the same thing. And are there kind of specific things that you have learned in your training or your degrees in qualifying as a psychologist that you really specifically apply to your writing? Like Stephanie, I'd like, Stephanie, I want to talk to you a bit more about this later, but I know, for example, you think a lot about, you know, developmental psychology in creating plausible characters and character motivations and things like that. So if we kind of boil that question down, you know, thinking about the fact that there are these big overlaps and these big connections between psychology and writing, are there kind of specific pieces of knowledge that you feel you have as a psychologist that gives you a little edge over authors who maybe don't have a psychology background, although obviously may have expertise elsewhere? So Stephanie, do you want to go first with that question?
I think when you're immersed in psychology for so long, just writing from your gut will naturally be coloured by your experience of how people work. But teaching people, I would say people find
wow, that was impressive. I've never heard a sneeze do that. Wait a minute, we've got Nick Collier who's been unmuting himself again. Okay, crack on.
Yeah, I think once I started teaching writers and seeing where the gaps were, people find attachment theory really helpful. Attachment theory really helpful in terms of having consistency across a character arc and understanding where that comes from, and just anything that's about an internal framework. So I give people tasks that are based on different models, but just so that when they're thinking about the lens the character sees through, they can tie it to something. But I think when you're doing it yourself, you don't need to write out a formulation or a diagram. You can maybe apply that after to check where there's inconsistency, because occasionally your own stuff will pour in and give drift. But I think a lot of it, you get it out on the page, then you figure it out.
You have to plug it in, don't you?
Oh,
What have you done?
hang on a sec. It's so funny how many people join without muting themselves. Hang on. There we go. So yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a really good point, Stephanie. I often forget what I know and forget that certain things aren't basic standard knowledge for people, because like you say, you know, we use it all the time in our work, and it does become second nature of thinking, well, you know, in humans this X and Y are related, or da 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 da, and then we kind of, yeah, we forget that we learned that at some point, that we, you know, we did, that's not something that people work out on their own necessarily. What about you, Emma? Are there particular things from your training and sort of academic background that you find particularly useful to translate into your writing, in any elements of your writing?
Yeah, I think I for a long time I thought I had a bit of an issue, because I would be telling stories and I would get so embedded in the psychological research that was kind of appropriate for those stories. In my Wolf trilogy, I write about a psychopath who, you know, it plays with the concept of identity. And I spent so much time researching the academic literature, so I would know that the facts and what does the science tell us about how his brain was formed and why he developed the way he is and how he influences other people. That I was complaining to my agent one day about how much research I'd done. I'm like, this isn't normal. Normal people don't do this. And she rang me back an hour later and went, do you want to write a non-fiction about it? I was like, well, that's a good idea. So I feel like, for me, I think you hit the nail on the head, Philippa, when you said that both of my careers are about explaining humanity to myself. And part of how I process information, and part of how I understand is going through the academic literature and knowing what has, you know, this scientific community that does tend to be quite closed off. What have they got to say that we can then take into the world of story? And by doing that, it's almost like you open up that science to a whole world of people who would never dream of picking up an academic article because they're normal, you know, and they don't get their thrills like I do. But, you know, there's so much information embedded in there that's so useful. And, you know, a lot of people don't have access to it. So for me, I think that's, so it's less from my training, more from my basic nerdiness, I think, is what I have to say.
Oh, I just saw a cat in the background. First cat of the night, ding.
Yay.
Yeah, absolutely. And what about you, Chris?
Yeah, sorry if there are some strange noises or movements coming from my camera. That is Poppy, the cat. In fact, there she is.
Hi, Poppy.
She always just kind of follows whenever there's a noise or a voice or a call or something. She'll just come and say hello and get involved. So anyway, she is. Yeah, I think Stephanie mentioned formulation, which is a kind of an approach or a tool in clinical psychology where you're thinking about different factors that are relevant for a person. You know, what's their kind of what in their background might have led them to the situation they're in today, what kind of triggered the situation off, what's keeping it going, what might stop them from fixing that situation and fixing it. And it's funny actually thinking about that. I sort of try to take that approach when I'm particularly thinking about central characters in a book, but I think it also maps quite closely to, you know, character arc or story arc. If anyone's read anything about kind of craft of storytelling and setting up a story, you know, you've got your inciting incident, you've got your character's background, you've got the challenges, that you've got their goal that they want to achieve, and then things that are stopping them from getting there. So I think thinking about that approach, I find it very useful in writing, and for me it's very interesting how closely it maps, I think, to story and character arc. And then I think with more thinking about the kind of plot of a book, it's that idea of trying to put yourself in the reader's mind of if you reveal this much information and you give the reader this much or this piece of information, what will they be thinking? What will they be feeling? You know, what will they know? What won't they know? And kind of mapping that over the course of a book, just so you're giving people enough to kind of keep them engaged and keep them intrigued, hopefully, but you're not completely giving the game away. But equally, you're not holding so much back so that they're kind of, they either switch off, or you're misleading them so much they feel cheated when they find out what's really going on. So there is a process of kind of a bit of mentalization, you might say. You're imagining what the reader is going to be thinking as you're writing something.
I love that, Chris. Yeah, I think I totally agree with both points, actually. Both that first one about, I sometimes talk about, the stages of grief model, which was obviously a model initially designed to sort of formulate the kind of stages that people may go through, the common stages that people go through after a bereavement. But I think it applies more generally to any really big change in life, because any big change is going to involve some sort of loss, even when it's a positive change. And I think, yeah, those kind of beats that we talk about in a story arc, as you say, the status quo, the inciting incident, the kind of the obstacles and trials and tribulations that they go through in that middle build or saggy middle, and then that kind of reckoning at the end where there has to be a real internal shift for that person to ultimately triumph. We use that arc in stories, and I think the reason that that's the core arc that all stories tend to work with is that's the human arc of how we process change. And I think as well about plot, I love what you're saying about getting that balance of sort of keeping curiosity high and keeping the intrigue up, but not letting the cat out of the bag. And it is a really difficult balance, isn't it? And being able to empathize, kind of put ourselves in, mentalize and empathize, put ourselves in the reader's shoes. But I don't know if you still find, Chris, that you still need to check it out with another reader, because you still, even though we're psychologists, we still can't actually read minds. So we can never quite.
Oh, for sure, yeah. And that's where you're kind of, the editorial team kind of comes in and gives their perspective on it, and they're always going to see things that you haven't seen or thought of. And I thought, actually, when you're talking about stages of grief model, I thought that you were going to talk about dealing with feedback from editors. I think very useful. Denial, rage, acceptance, whatever.
Depression, yeah. Yeah, bargaining. Yeah. I'm just sort of looking through my little list of questions. So obviously we've talked about kind of how psychology can inform and shape and help us with our writing. What about if we look at that connection the other way around? Because again, as psychologists, we always like to look at, the bi-directional thing, about whether there's how writing can sort of help us psychologically, or are there ways that your writing has informed your psychology practice, or that you think about writing as a tool to help people psychologically? They're slightly two different questions, but yeah, let's start with you, Stephanie.
Yeah, I wish I had more scope in my practice, because I think to do it safely and do it well, you don't want to just sort of wing it. And I'd like to do a proper program with groups. And what happened is in my previous trust, which was a mental health trust, they had like a Dragon's Den panel, and I went to panel and asked if I could help build an anthology of short fiction by patients and service users, and got approval and got funding. Went and did my first class, which was community learning disability team and service users from there, which was just an absolute joy, with loads of prompts and helping people structure and come up with a story idea. And then COVID struck and the whole thing just stopped. And then I got a new job. And it was a shame, because I think there's something about who gets to have a voice and tell their stories. And we're quite privileged in the way that we can. And all these groups of people who maybe don't get that opportunity and need some structure to help them, a scaffolding really around being able to do it. And I think in child work, actually, you do narrative work all the time, because that's what play is. You're creating stories, you're giving characters. And we'd say it's externalizing. So you get the toys, they tell the story, especially because I worked with children being removed from their parents. They can't say things about their parents that are different, they're too torn, and it'd be cruel to do it. But if you get a doll's house and you get a range of characters, they show you everything. They can tell the story, they can change the ending of the story or whatever it is. So in a way, the play is the story, which I think they're the same thing. It's just one gets written down and one doesn't. And so there you're giving voice and story to people who might struggle with their language or could be non-verbal, for example. So I think there are lots of ways, but we could do more. And there's a study, so the client group I work with have non-epileptic attacks. And there is a study in London looking at using writing as an intervention to help process some traumas in a way that wouldn't totally overwhelm and bring up too much seizure activity. So I'm keeping an eye out for the evidence base, really. I don't want to jump in. I want to be really careful about it. But I think it can happen in such informal ways. But maybe we need to be braver, particularly in the NHS. So my next plan I'm doing some work with maternities, so with midwives and midwives' wellbeing. And next year I'd like to try something that involves writing for the midwives themselves and the incredible, stressful, traumatic job they do, to help them on a physical and psychological level. That'd be exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And sorry about that. That was one of our new unmuted members. I actually did my my psychology clinical doctorate on using therapeutic writing with eating disorders based on the work of James Pennebaker. And I think, it's really interesting what you're saying, Stephanie, about storytelling being a way of sharing or processing your own experiences, but kind of at one step removed. So maybe it's that little bit safer, that little bit more manageable. What about you, Chris?
Yeah, I've worked in that way a little bit, kind of therapeutically. Some kind of, for example, working with trauma, people writing letters to themselves, re-scripting a trauma, for example, or perhaps doing a timeline, which is a kind of a narrative that they might write out. They might, illustrate certain parts of it. I think also similar, maybe to what Stephanie said in terms of that kind of externalizing, using a story to externalize something. I spent some time working with children and young people who had OCD, and we'd always try and externalize the OCD and give it a name, and often it would, and sometimes draw a picture of it, and it would often look like a kind of monster or something, and that was quite a helpful technique, I think. But yeah, I've also read, I mean, thinking about crime fiction and the kind of the benefits that can have for people. There has been some research on that, actually, that in fact reading crime fiction itself can have some kind of therapeutic benefit. There's an academic called Liz Brewster at Lancaster University who's looked into this and done some qualitative work around it, and there's an element of like exposure therapy to it, where people might confront something that it might be a little bit triggering for them or cause them some low level of anxiety, but in a safe way, because they know it's in a book and they can close it and put it down, and allow themselves to sort of adjust to and assimilate that level of anxiety in a way that you would do in a kind of therapeutically. People are sort of doing that naturally as they read a piece of crime fiction. That was at least what people identified in this study. So I think there's also a therapeutic benefit potentially of crime and thriller.
Yeah, and I really like that idea, like especially what I was saying earlier about maybe giving up, starting to move away from my kind of core identity as a psychologist. Remember, a friend of mine says, but you'll still be a therapist by writing books. And I was like, you validated me, Chris. What about you, Emma? How do you see the kind of links between writing and psychology, but looking at it that way around, how writing can play into psychology?
I mean, I think a lot of what I do and I've always done is trauma based. And I think that, we all know there's really solid evidence suggesting that the use of narrative and writing as a tool to help process the trauma. I think one of the things that I think crime fiction can offer, you said about in terms of crime fiction helping us process traumas within society. And I think that that's a really important thing, especially now, you know, that when we're in this period when we've all been through this kind of massive worldwide trauma, and it feels like so many more people are communicating and sharing their stories and their narratives, that we're almost normalizing the trauma response, you know, and it's like we're removing this kind of this disordered thinking around it, and reframing it as a normal response to an abnormal situation. And I think crime fiction does that beautifully, because it is all about people who are in the worst scenario. You know, we put our characters in the worst scenarios we can imagine, and then we say, okay, go deal with it. One of the things we know in terms of post-traumatic growth, you know, we know post-traumatic growth is not only can happen, but the probabilities are really good, but especially when people have a narrative that they can relate to. You know, if they have seen stories of people going through trauma and recovering, if they have seen how normal it is to feel a trauma reaction, to be disturbed by it, to have your world tipped upside down, and yet slowly and gradually to recover, I think that that gives our readers a really optimistic view of where they can get to. You know, I think in the past we have looked at trauma as something goes wrong and that's it. You know, that will shape the entirety of your life. And I'd like to think that part of what we do as crime writers is to help nudge that notion along a little and say, no, it will be a part of your life, obviously, but it will become something of yours that you will develop from, and you will process, and it will not define you. So I think we've got a massive role to play in terms of helping people with psychological health.
Yeah, absolutely. I really like that idea of kind of, yeah, because even in crime stories, usually at the end, things are resolved in some shape or form, aren't they? Like generally in books, the hero wins, not always, obviously, but I think that's a really nice way of modeling this idea that, trauma is not, experiencing a traumatic event is not the end of the road. It's just it's another change, isn't it? And showing that going through a process of change, but you can come out the other side, into a new position or whatever. I just want to remind our lovely audience members that please do put any questions that you have in the chat. If you can just put the word question at the start, that will mean it's easy for me to spot what's a question versus a comment on a cat, for example, because we really want to make this panel, as kind of informative as possible. And is everything all right, Jan? Okay, hang on one sec. This is what happens when you put the link on Twitter, is you may end up with some some hijacking. Please do ask any questions that you've got. Preface it by the word question, and we would be very, very happy to answer your questions as we go along. I just sort of picking up on what you were saying, Emma, about using writing to change some of the perceptions around, for example, trauma and how people might respond to trauma. Do you think that, because I know that I write quite directly about, in some of my books anyway, kind of mental health issues quite directly. So for example, my protagonist in my second book, Safe and Sound, has quite a specific anxiety disorder. And I wondered about kind of writing directly about mental health in our books, like how easy that is to do, how difficult, and, any pitfalls with that, or whether we shy away from it. Maybe kicking off with you, Chris.
Sorry, Philippa, I didn't quite catch the end of the question.
I think I rambled, but I was just asking about your experiences of writing specifically about mental health in books, because it's such a sensitive subject, and kind of how it's portrayed, whether we kind of go there in our writing using our expertise, how it lands with readers, that kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think there's obviously when you've worked therapeutically and you've heard people's stories about difficulties that they've encountered, and you know how sort of common it is for people to experience, whether it's mood, anxiety, trauma, whatever it might be, or even something that's perhaps a little bit rarer, but still quite possible for any of us to experience, which is a sort of things shading into maybe in the psychosis spectrum, depending on what somebody's circumstances are. I think kind of writing on that, kind of touching on it.
Sorry, I just need to find the person who's not muted. Hang on a sec. I feel like we should play guess the sound. Like, what is that?
I have no idea what that was.
I have no idea either. Oh my God, guys, I am sorry. Okay, go on. Sorry, go on. I'm putting this person in the waiting room too.
Yeah. So yeah, I think when you've heard those kinds of stories, you can write about them in a way that makes it perhaps relatable to readers who may not have experienced something like that, but could do potentially, or maybe they know someone who has, and you're kind of normalizing it from a point of view of a bit of knowledge, not presenting it as something that's kind of othered, and I've definitely seen perhaps more in film than in books. I've seen some really unhelpful depictions of mental health that sort of make out people with mental health disorders to be, this person is a killer because they have a mental health problem, or their mental health problem has turned them into some sort of psychopath, or I don't know, just something that is really othering in quite an unhelpful way, I think. So yeah, basically using a bit of knowledge of how commonly, even if a person doesn't have a diagnosable disorder or set of difficulties, let's say, they might just still relate to some of the experiences from the mental health angle.
Yeah, absolutely. What about you, Stephanie? How do you think about portraying mental health in your fiction?
I'd say the same. It's the relatability. So I don't think I tend to mention diagnoses, but it's just presenting. So in the novel that's coming out in February, the main character clearly has some anxiety difficulties, and then flashbacks to her mum's more significant mental health issues. But laying it out in the story in an understandable way rather than labeling it, so that it's got that recognizability and it doesn't get tied to a particular diagnosis, I think is helpful, because I deliberately wanted there to be recognizable elements in the main character who's fairly, she's managing to hold down a job, but there is substantial impact from the thoughts that she has and the way that she treats herself. And part of what she does is she has negative thoughts that come up, and she has to carry on a bit like when messages come up that are unkind.
Do you know what? Sorry. Do you know what? I'm just going to chip in and say, because I know Nikki O'Shea, and I know that she would not type that message. So, like, I think, yeah, it's not just for Nikki, it's like, it's not for me. Okay, right. Sorry everyone for the hacking. I have deleted the tweets off Twitter and Facebook. So it's like we've got that negative thought voice in our heads, isn't it? Like, boring, shut up.
Yeah. And that's exactly what I do in the book, because it's from the therapist's point of view. I show the self-attacking thoughts that she has, to just normalize that the therapists get them as well, in the therapy room, outside of the therapy room. And yet, what you might see is quite different to what's going on internally. So I've kept it like that, non-diagnostic kind of approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's good to kind of keep it a bit fudgy, isn't it? And I think that's how I do it. Kind of keep it blurred, just like you say, kind of not othering it, Chris, as well. Just, this is a person with difficulties, and how you want to diagnose that. That's a whole separate question, isn't it? What about you, Emma? I know that your background isn't clinical psychology, but again, like you say, a lot of your work involves trauma and maybe other kinds of mental health issues as well.
I think it's really important what Stephanie just said, that we represent within our fiction not just the extremes of mental health issues, but almost like the low level normal version of it, like that, like the thoughts, and I think to have that identifiable within our characters in terms of, in certain circumstances, everybody will experience anxiety, everybody will experience negative thoughts, and to have that come out as a narrative that it's not, it doesn't mean that you then belong to a certain category of people. It just means that you're human, and that's what we do. So I think I'm quite careful about using things like PTSD or sort of abuse backgrounds. I think I'm always very mindful of what I'm trying to achieve for the reader. When you introduce topics like this, where are we going with it? So I think if there is a really good narrative purpose, that's fine. I think that you can kind of run afoul of it when there is when it becomes a go-to place, when it becomes a sort of an obvious place to go. So I'm a little bit cautious about that.
That's really reassuring for me when you all of you say like you don't like go too hardcore onto the kind of specific diagnostic categories, and you just keep it quite loose, because I think that's how I approach it. And I always feel like, am I being a bit cowardly in my writing, but actually I think it's kind of better that way, isn't it? Like character comes first rather than diagnosis. So I'm going to pick up some questions from our audience, and just to reiterate, because I know a few people have still just very recently joined us, because we put the links, the Zoom link out kind of publicly, because I know there was problems logging in. We do sometimes have some bot hackers, so if you see some very strange messages in the chat or strange noises, that's what it is. Best case, like with a naughty dog, let's just ignore it and move on, right? So this is a question from the lovely Gemma Flynn to Stephanie in particular, saying, would you consider looking into writing for trauma for other healthcare professionals, such as paramedics?
I think there are people already doing this work who've done specific training in using writing in this way. I think what we need is the buy-in from the NHS, rather than people having to fund things for themselves, which I think is how it tends to currently stand. There has been an explosion in staff support, but I think still it's so limited that people, and maybe we're not being creative enough in our ideas. So I'm hoping that some pilots in one area might spread, but really maybe those of us who do work in the NHS and also write need to try and influence higher up, really, because it's something that's got quite a good evidence base in terms of health and inflammation and well-being, without having people taking time off sick, without relying on medication. And coming here tonight's made me think more about being an advocate and being a voice for the strength of this, rather than, wouldn't that be nice if it magically happens sometime? Because it won't happen without us being that voice, I think. So thank you for the question. I hope so.
So Casey Chamberlain has asked, and we've sort of touched on this a little bit, do you find it tricky to find a balance between accuracy and leaning towards too much information when you're writing? And I guess it's a bit like we were talking about last time with, say, historical fiction writers, when you've got all your kind of facts and your research and your knowledge, and not letting that get in the way of the story. So Chris, do you want to say a little bit about how you hopefully get that balance right?
I mean, hopefully I get it right. It's something I try to work quite hard at. I think it probably applies across all areas of research for a book, and I'm sure everyone's read books that have a kind of research dump in them, which is it can be sometimes quite frustrating to read, or you're like, oh, okay, this is all the stuff that the author found out when they were looking into this particular issue, and now it's all on the same, they will put it all on the same page. So I think the skill is kind of in using your research or using your knowledge in a way that just gives that bit of authenticity, maybe kind of informs the reader a little bit, but without sort of bashing them over the head with it. And you know, I don't know, I mean, there are people like Lee Child and David Baldacci, you know, really big time thriller writers who will talk about doing sort of like a whole week of, or particularly David Baldacci, a whole week of research on something, and then it's one line in the book. I don't know how true that is, or how many people have the luxury of time to be able to do that. But I think certainly when you've got knowledge of psychology, it's tempting to put loads in, or put in stuff about particular symptoms or particular therapeutic techniques, but you're kind of also trying to put yourself in the position of the reader. And fundamentally, if you're writing a thriller, you've got to keep the pages turning, and the more technical stuff you put in, the more accurate you make it, the more you're going to slow it down, and potentially the more you're going to sort of tie your hands in terms of drama as well. So yeah, it's a tough balance to strike, and you don't always get it right.
Yeah, what about you, Emma? How do you find it?
I always like to take the approach of the iceberg of knowledge. So, you know, when I was teaching police and military, I always wanted to make sure that the information I had, I would be delivering about 20%, but there would be 80% under the surface, because you just never know what kind of questions are going to come up, what issues are going to be raised. And I think the same is true with writing. I think that you have to be aware that often the knowledge is for you and not for the reader. And so it's about informing yourself so that you can move forward with confidence, but realistically, the reader will get to experience a very small percentage of that. And the other thing I think is really important in this issue is having an editor, or my agent is one of my first editors. She edits every book I do, and she's one of the first people to go, what are you talking about? Stop talking, just get on with the action. You know, so I think, you know, no matter how many books you write, there is a point at which you can't see where your pacing issues come in. So, you know, I think always having that next line of defense is a good thing, because that will become really obvious. And then they point it out and you're like, oh my God, yes, that's really embarrassing. Sorry about that.
Oh, Stephanie Carty decided to leave us and come back. Rude. I will catch up with her in a sec. In the meantime, we've got a really nice question here from Laura Beasley. Sorry, Laura, if I'm not pronouncing your name correctly. I'm interested in journaling for well-being. Is there a psychological theory behind this? I'll chip in with my knowledge about that, Laura. I think the background that I know about it is there was a researcher called James Pennebaker, well, he may still be alive, who basically investigated the use of expressive writing and did a whole range of studies and found that it was helpful in all sorts of ways for many, many different kinds of health benefits. And I will just find a little link for you, Laura, and put it in the chat. And you can have a little bit more of a look. And he has quite a specific paradigm of how to do the journaling. So that's quite nice if you're using it for yourself, or you know, recommending it to anybody, because I think there's ways to write that are helpful, and there's probably ways of writing which can make it could be quite a difficult way of exploring issues. But yeah, I will put something in the chat. What about any other of our panelists? Do you have any kind of knowledge about the psychological theory or psychological research behind writing or journaling for well-being?
Not especially, I have to say, for me. Sorry, not something I've looked into very much.
Have you heard of James Pennebaker, or is that niche because I did my thesis on it?
I don't think I have actually. Sorry for that.
Oh, well, that's fine. My thesis was useful for something in the end.
Yeah, I have now.
This is just a quick information leaflet from Laura. This is just a quick information leaflet from a particular study, but so I just quickly sort of Googled it. It's not anyone that I'm particularly referencing, but I'll give you a bit of an idea if you want to find out a little bit more about James Pennebaker and the research. Great. So there was another great question in here, as well as some quite funny comments. I still have to say, I think that hacked one from who is it from again? Nikki, which was, what the F is this dumb class? Good question. Yes, okay, great. So another audience question is, so this is from Kingsley. This is more of a comment, perhaps. Hang on, let me read it. Great to hear the panel's perspective on the portrayal of mental health in fiction, how to do that better, as I found it frustrating when the explanation for typically the antagonist behavior ends up being because they were crazy. I totally agree, Kingsley. And I'm going to share a little link as well here, which is for the consultancy for writers service that I run kind of alongside my psychology practice, which is basically, I put it in the chat for you guys. It's basically for anyone who is writing about psychology, psychologists, mental health, that kind of thing, and want to try and get it right and want to do an accurate and sensitive portrayal. I'm more than happy to kind of, sort of discuss your outlines or your manuscripts or whatever with you. So I've dropped the link in the chat then, and feel free to help you.
Can I just
yeah, go on, Chris.
Philippa, just to chip in on Kingsley's comment there. Thanks, Kingsley, for that. I also totally agree. It's one of the least satisfying explanations at the end of a book, or to account for a character's actions because they were crazy, and very othering, very unsatisfying as a reader. It's sort of up there with, the killer is unmasked and the detective or whoever says, why did you do it? And they said, because I could. It's that level of unsatisfying, just not good as a reader to be kind of to have that, or a viewer, of a film, because it's another classic. The other thing you often see is the split personality, and writers just thinking, oh yeah, I'll create a character who's got multiple personalities, and one of their personalities is they're a serial killer, and then in all their other personalities they don't even realize they're a serial killer. And just the sort of psychological kind of unbelievability of that is infuriating.
Yeah, it is annoying, isn't it? And I think again, it's really interesting when you keep talking about othering, Chris, because I think it is that sense of othering, isn't it? Rather than recognizing that mental health problems are so normal, like someone who is anxious or has an anxiety disorder, they're not crazy. There's someone with an anxiety disorder, and think about what you're like when you feel anxious, and now multiply that to an extreme. So yeah, I think what about you, Emma? What do you feel about that, the whole thing about good portrayals and bad portrayals? And I will just tag in this lovely question from Hannah Upton, who says, if any of you've read Sorrow and Bliss, I'm curious as to what you thought about the diagnosis not being named. Do you mean, Hannah, you could maybe clarify in another comment, do you mean what do we think the unnamed diagnosis is, or do you mean what do we think about the fact that the diagnosis is never named in the book? But yeah, Hannah, if you want to kind of kick off with just if you know any really bad portrayals of psychology in books.
I think this is always the question, because it comes up so often. We write fiction, so does that mean we can just throw all the authenticity out? I've spent my entire adult life has been spent around police officers, and I'm married to a police officer, so watching police programs on TV and then asking whether authenticity matters when my husband's in the room, you don't really need the question anymore, because when you have something that is so obviously inauthentic, and it's so obviously not how it would happen, it really pulls you out of the story. So I think it's really damaging for your reader's ability to get involved, or the viewer's ability to get involved. And I think the same thing is true for psychological portrayals. I think if you're going to do it, then you should do it with respect. You should put the time in so that you're talking about the right thing. But I also think that, you know, if you're going to use these things within a narrative, then you have to use them authentically and appropriately. You know, I don't think we get to kind of go, oh, it's just fiction, so it doesn't really matter.
Yeah, in fact, I think going back to what we were saying earlier about, you know, people turning to books to help them make sense of their world and their experiences and their lives, I think, in fact, we have a real responsibility to get it right, because most people, fingers crossed, are not going to see the inside of a police station, for example. So if a police procedural isn't maybe done quite right, it maybe doesn't matter too much for people. But actually, if mental health is portrayed poorly, then, you know, that could be really unhelpful, because most of us are going to encounter some sort of stress or strain on our mental health at some time. And if we're reading books that say, you know, you're weird and you're crazy and you're an other and you're going to go around killing everybody if you have a mental health problem, you know, that's not useful. Hannah helpfully clarified for us that she means the fact that in Sorrow and Bliss, the diagnosis is never actually named, the sort of various symptoms and presentations described and referred to, but it's never actually pinned down. Have either of you read that book? Or
No,
I think I've read it, and yeah, it's an interesting question. I think I quite liked trying to guess, and I quite liked the fact that it was left open, so maybe each reader can project their own possible syndrome or diagnosis onto it, depending on what they may have experienced themselves. But I know who else was in, Nikki was saying that she found it really annoying. I'm not sure. We'd have to, how about we try and contact the author and try and ask her that very question? Should we see if we can get an answer? Just going back to another question from Hannah, I'll come back to your other question, tying into your work as a journalist, because I think it's maybe quite a fun one to end on. And I just saw Stevie has asked, have you got any writing tips for getting inside the mind or psychology of a character? P.S. You guys have been fantastic. Well, I quite agree. So now Stephanie's not here, because I would have liked to. Is Stephanie not here? She disappears somewhere. I know she maybe had to sort kids out, but I will post a link, because Stephanie has some very specific courses on this, Stevie. But Chris, shall I sort of again come to you? Do you have any particular tips for getting the psychology of a character right?
Well, I would maybe, I mean, thanks, Stevie, as well for that comment and for your question. I mean, I'd maybe come back to what I said earlier about that, what we'd call in clinical psychology, you know, the formulation approach. So you're thinking about the character's background, and you've got your character existing usually in the present. There might be kind of multiple time points that you're writing about in a book, but I'd encourage anyone writing a character or developing a character to think back to what was that character's early life like, what was their upbringing, their home life, you know, who was around them when they were growing up, what were the key influences, and how did that shape who they are as a person. I always find that very satisfying to get that depth, and I think you can then account for some of what people do in the present, especially if you're writing about kind of more extreme behaviors, or why somebody might be experiencing a particular set of difficulties. And then those other questions of, like, you know, what brought them to where they are now, or what is it that's important to them in their life that has brought them into this situation. What is it that they want? What are they trying to achieve? What are their strengths that can help them get there? What are their issues that stop them? And trying to really build out a rounded profile. That would be my advice.
What about you, Emma?
I have spreadsheets. So to go full on the nerd approach, for every character in all of my books, I have a spreadsheet, and I catalogue everything from the basic descriptors, and it's amazing how many times you forget your color, your character's hair color, excuse me, to their address, where they grew up, what kind of house do they live in, what kind of job do they do, how do they get to work. All of those little daily routines, those little sort of nuggets that don't seem very important, can be really valuable in adding up, so that we can get to a point where we understand who our character is and where they come from. One of the things that I always do for every character is work out who they are in relation to the other people in their lives. So if they have children, you know, what is their relationship like with their children, with their siblings, with their partner? I think you'll often find that people are very different depending on who they're relating to. So it can be a really good way of getting into your character's head is by understanding them through all of these different perspectives.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I think that knowing that humans are, even if on the outside their behavior looks very strange, there's always an internal logic to it. So even if you can just boil down in that particular scene, what does the character, what's the character trying to do? What does the character want? It might be as simple as like, get out of this room, or persuade so-and-so to agree with me, or whatever it is. What do they believe? Like, in their eyes, how is the world working? You know, do they believe that, you know, people are generally helpful? Do they believe that they can run fast? You know, these kind of things. And their choice of action and their choice of behavior is going to depend on basically a mixture of what do they want and what do they believe. And if they're, you know, their behavior starts to look really strange when what they want doesn't tie in with what they're doing, or what they are doing doesn't tie in with things we know about them already in terms of what they believe. So if they believe that they are, you know, highly capable and competent of looking after themselves, it wouldn't make sense if they don't get up and open the door themselves when they to get out of their room. Do you know what I mean? You'd be like, what? So I think just looking for those internal consistencies in what a character believes and what they want, and how that links or doesn't link with the actions and the choices that they make. Because that's one of the things sometimes that you read a book where the character's decision making just is really infuriating, because you just think, why are you doing that when this option is available to you? So yeah, but as I say, Stevie, I've put a little link for you to Stephanie's courses, which you may find helpful. Okay, we're going to start to wrap things up, and I'm going to come back to your question, Nikki, about the books list, which yes, so basically all the authors who are taking part in our panels obviously have great books that they have written, and I'm putting a link in the chat now to the bookshop page where you basically will be able to find them all. So obviously if you want to support the authors taking part in this panel and in the other panels, or if you like the sound of what you've heard tonight and are particularly interested in their books, do pop along to that book link and a bookshop link and see what you can find. So that's for you, Nikki, and everybody else. And I'd like to sort of maybe wrap things up with this nice question from Hannah Upton, which she says, as a former journalist, it's always painful for me to see improbable portrayals of journalism in fiction. So I'd love to know some of the most common or outlandish blunders you've seen in fiction work with your knowledge as a psychologist. So yeah, what do we tend to most cringe at that as psychologists we know is just not how it is? I'll start with you, Emma.
Okay, well, two hats on. So the psychologist hat and the policing hat. Line of duty, stop giving everybody guns. They don't have guns. It's very stressful for everybody.
Oh, but that makes it much more fun.
The guy walks into a police station, he's like, I'd like a gun, please. And they're like, yeah, sure, have a gun. So there's that. And I think Chris referenced to earlier, multiple personality disorder. It's everywhere. It's rife. Gosh, we seem to be really stricken with that as an issue. So yeah, those are my two biggies.
What about you, Chris? What really gets your goat when it comes to psychology showing up in fiction?
I think it's for me it's often the portrayals of the therapist, and you could certainly have a therapist who maybe has some kind of malevolent intent. That might be an interesting kind of character thing to play with, but in the therapy session itself, I've seen several depictions of a therapist as being quite antagonistic towards a client, the person who they're supposed to be helping, and they're either goading them, or they're trying to catch them out, or there's some kind of, they're trying to trick them in some way. I was just reading a book very recently where that was being done by a psychologist, and I thought that this is kind of not right. So that sort of portrayal, because as a mental health professional, you're always trying to help someone. You're not trying to catch them out, and you're certainly not trying to start an argument with them, which results in them storming out of the room. Although occasionally that does happen, but usually not because you've started an argument with them. The other thing that comes up quite often is where people are having, maybe someone's supposed to be having a sort of a therapy session in the NHS, and it's super kind of psychoanalytic, and it's really like loads of stuff around dream interpretation or that sort of thing, and you just think there are therapists who do that, but it's not what you would encounter in a kind of regular session of therapy in the NHS most of the time. But people, it's in the popular imagination that that's what therapy is like. It's, you go in and talk about your dreams and that kind of thing. And, so that sort of thing, where I think maybe just the writer had done a little bit more research, or the screenwriter had done a little bit more research, it would be just more compelling, I think.
Yeah. And I think I would chip in and say, again, probably the portrayals of therapists, where a bit like what you're saying, Chris, that them being just very strange or inappropriate or unproductive in their therapeutic style, but also therapists breaching boundaries. And sometimes you might want to write a book in which a therapist breaches boundaries, but it's when it's written as if this is a normal way for a therapist to behave. So, for example, a therapist turning up at the door of a patient in the middle of the night saying, "Oh, I was just worried about you," that would be a huge breach of boundaries. And you could have that in a book, but you would really need to flag that this therapist was acting in a very, very problematic way, and in a way that they would probably have to have some sort of suspension or discipline or something like that with their supervisor. So I think again, it's problematic, because what we don't want is people to be put off going to therapy, thinking that my therapist is going to badger me, my therapist is going to provoke me and criticize me, or my therapist is going to turn up on my doorstep in the middle of the night. So I think how we portray therapists and therapy is really important. And the other thing that I've noticed, and I wonder if it's a little bit like medical portrayals, where it's kind of become the done thing that whenever anyone's in a hospital, they always have like a drip attached to them and a beeping heart monitor, which apparently is not true for most admissions. But it's kind of become the shorthand for this person is poorly in hospital, is having characters who have sort of OCD or OCD traits, who just have a sort of random counting ritual that doesn't seem to link to anything particular, but they always tap their finger 5 times when they're nervous or something like that. And I don't know, I wonder if that's become a bit of a shorthand of just portraying someone who's anxious, and that's not OCD. That's not what OCD is. So yeah, and I think some of these portrayals are more harmful than others, aren't they? But yeah, as I say, please contact me if you want consultation on portraying mental health problems. Okay, guys, we're just kind of at the end of our time for tonight. And again, I want to hugely apologize for all the technical problems that we've had this evening. I'm so pleased that so many of you are still able to join us and have participated so much. It's been a real pleasure for us. I'll just do a little reminder that I have been recording this, and I will put it up on my YouTube channel, hopefully this evening. Oh,
YouTube channel. What's the name of your YouTube channel?
I think that's some serious.
What's the name of your YouTube channel?
Hang on one sec. So I will be putting it up on YouTube, and oh, one sec. And yes, the last thing, I'm just putting in the chat a link to our third and last panel. If you've managed to kind of cope with all the shenanigans tonight and you want to come to our third one, I've just put the link in here. And yeah, you can sign up there. I'm going to contact Eventbrite and see if I can figure out what was tricky tonight. But anyway, thank you so much. Thank you so much, Chris. Thank you so much, Emma. Thank you so much, Stephanie. And remember, do check out that link to the bookshop from before. So Emma Kavanagh is the writer of a number of crime and thriller books. And Chris Merritt is author of 2 different crime series, and also most recently a standalone book. And Stephanie's book Shattered is debut fiction book Shattered is due for release next year. So please do check those out. I highly recommend all of them. Again, just thank you so much for coming, and yes, have a good rest of your evening.
Thanks everyone. Thank you, Philippa.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Wow. Emma and Chris, if you want to hang on for just a sec, and we'll just have a quick chat at the end. And yeah, just thank you everyone, and hopefully see you next time. Oh, there we go. Oh, well, thanks guys. I'm assuming that Stephanie just had to dash off for something or other. Sorry, I'm just hang on, just making another quick email for another poor person who can get in. But thank you so much, guys. I know it was a little bit hairy tonight, but yeah, just thank you so much. And it was I think we weathered the storms reasonably.
Hopefully.
Well. That was exciting.
It kept us on our toes. Yeah, and as I say, I will put the recording up. I know that with last time we had kind of about double the number of people came and watched the recording, so I'm sure that we'll get plenty of views on the recording for people who weren't able to be here tonight.
Brilliant. Thanks, Philippa.
You're so welcome.
Thank you.
All right,
Cheers.
take good care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.